about yourself, your background, why you chose to engage with the peace process or not?
Okay, my name is Stephen White. I'm a retired police officer. When I left university in Belfast, I joined the police and had a long police career within what was called the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which then became the Police Service of Northern Ireland during the Reform period. And it's because I was in a senior position when the Good Friday Agreement was signed and the changes to policing were announced that I was very heavily involved in what would be called the peace process and also security sector reform. And I'm very proud of the fact that I was part of it.
You mentioned the Good Friday Agreement, and we know that the Good Friday Agreement marked a turning point in Ireland's history. In your view, what has been the most profound impact of the agreement on Irish society?
Well, I'm very conscious of the lead up to it. So first and foremost, there was the change in attitude, in a sense, almost a change in culture, not just within policing and the security sector, but within the community itself, in that we had the ceasefires being declared by the terrorist groups. We had the responses to that from policing, and particularly the security services, who were thinking, is this permanent? Is this genuine? I remember all the politicians and the various views that they were expressing, that, this is a bluff, or this is sincere, and there were various views. Policing was being, in a sense, torn apart because, in one sense, we wanted to be more involved in community policing, in that style of policing, whereas at the same time, we were very conscious we also had a role to protect the state, to protect the communities, to protect the country. And we needed to be careful that we didn't let our guard down. So for me, the biggest impact on the peace process was that awareness that actually this is real. This isn't just a temporary ceasefire. This is something very significant, and it will have massive impact on policing. But that is my first and overriding memory of that period. Once the Good Friday Agreement was signed, then I think as a police officer, there were many milestones, many key events, some very sad, some very frustrating, and some very positive. So for police officers who had spent their lives, their professional lives, being told by Her Majesty the Queen and by prime ministers that crime is crime, murder is murder, and my government expects you as police officers to protect the community, to operate within the rule of law, to protect human rights, but at the same time, be strong against terrorists, be strong against criminality, get the evidence, prosecute, take to court, use all the criminal justice apparatus that's at our disposal. To be suddenly told after the Good Friday Agreement, or as part of the Good Friday Agreement, all those prisoners who police officers like me had spent a professional lifetime trying to prosecute and ensure that we had the evidence that would hold up in court, to see them released after 2 years, many of whom had murdered my friends, many of whom had murdered my colleagues, many of whom were responsible for the widows and the bereaved parents that I see still to this day on a regular basis being heartbroken. That was, I suppose, for me, one of the most frustrating impacts of it. The most positive, I suppose, is in 1994, my son would have been around 11, 12 years old. My daughter would have been 15, 16 years old. So there was a dawning and a realization that life will be better for them. As a teenager, I went into Belfast and there were bombs going off. I was a child born in the 50s, but a teenager in the late 60s and 70s. For me, going into Belfast city centre when bombs were going off and soldiers were patrolling the streets, and that sectarian hatred that was there and fighting between different parts of the community. For me to realise that my kids weren't going to have to put up with that, at least that was the hope, and indeed it is the reality most of the time. That was the positive thing. One other thing which I think is important to mention is that because policing was then under the spotlight, there was this feeling that we may get the blame, that for all the ills of this society, remember Northern Ireland was formed in 1921, the Royal Ulster Constabulary was formed in 1922, so for almost all this country's existence, the police department, called the Royal Ulster Constabulary, had tried to maintain law and order, had tried to deal with criminality, whether that be terrorism, violent extremism, sectarian disorderliness, whatever. We were in my opinion, the thin green line between the two warring factions, the two sides of the community which detested each other. One wanted to be purely Irish, one wanted to be purely British, and that hatred between the two. It was the police officers, the men and women of the RUC, who stood in the middle between those two factions. But somehow I could already detect within the Good Friday Agreement and within the aftermath and the Independent Commission on Policing, which was formed, there was this feeling that the police needs to change, the police needs to be better, therefore they must have been very good to begin with, and we need to reform them. Now, I believe that the police need to be better. I believe the police needed to change, but the police were changing. From 1922 to 1962 or 72, 82, policing has been developing around the world, whether it be in the USA, and you look at law enforcement in the late 60s and the Vietnam riots and so on. You look at how policing has been conducted now around the world. The community policing model that has been now seen as the forefront way of the foremost way of doing policing. That has all developed over years. Instead of the police doing it to people, the police enforcing the law, it's all about the police doing it with people, working in partnership and so on. We in the Royal UISCE, we knew that. I mean, I've studied policing, I have master's degrees in policing and related subjects. Any police officer of any rank or any knowledge or any experience would know that what we were asked to do in Northern Ireland was unique. It was difficult. We were practically soldiers in some police stations. We wore armoured jackets. We were in armoured vehicles. We carried rifles. We were fighting against armed insurrection and terrorism. So clearly we needed to change. But that doesn't mean to say we were wrong to begin with. We were protecting a community which was under threat constantly. And police officers, over 300 of them, lost their lives trying to protect the community. So there's somewhere in that period of the Good Friday Agreement and all the, hopefully, the peacemaking and the reconciliation that was expected, there was a fear within police officers that somehow we will be blamed when, in fact, if you look at the statistics, over the 30-year conflict, 52 civilians were killed by police. Every one of those cases was investigated and no officers were prosecuted. Over 3,000 people, civilians, were killed by terrorists. Police officers, soldiers, and civilians. Over 3,000 killed by terrorists. And yet those people were being released and being seen as not criminals, but somehow, from some people's perception, almost the victims. It's a shame. There was no alternative to murdering police officers when they were going to church or picking their kids up from school. Nonsense as far as I'm concerned. But that is some of the immediate reflections I'm going to offer you in terms of the peace process.
You mentioned change and you also mentioned progress. This brings to my next question, which is, what do you consider to be the biggest challenge that we have overcame to the peace building process in Ireland?
Well, I hate to be negative, but I don't think we have overcome the challenges. I think politics, if anything, is more divided. There are less men of violence, and there's certainly a lot less violence. But, even as we are speaking, a few miles from here, there were riots between two sections of the community, the same old section of the community, the same old areas that I used to police 30, 40 years ago. The police in the middle, police vehicles being attacked, police officers being attacked, petrol bombs being thrown, men of adult age standing in the shadows, directing young men, mostly young men, some children, to attack the police, because the police have got in between two warring factions that are saying, this is our territory and we don't want them, this is us, this is them, this is them, this is us. So for me, both with at community level, but definitely in politics, I believe there's still the deep divisions that exist. So I'm saying that in a pragmatic way. I do believe that is particularly in working class areas where there's deprivation, social deprivation, not the educational opportunities or the youth opportunities that one would expect in more developed parts of the city. And I'm talking about Belfast in particular, but it's not just in Belfast. So I believe that there are a lot of hurdles, a lot of challenges that still need to be overcome. One of the things that has happened, I suppose, is that police officers like me, and I'm an old grey-haired man now, retired and so on, but people like my son, who is still a police officer, people who are in the current leadership ranks of the police, I think there's a realisation that in terms of people who we need to engage with, it's not just the nice middle class, middle aged, respectable people within the community. There are people who have committed terrible crimes, terrorist crimes, who, whether we like it or not, have agency, have sway within their own communities. So people who normally police officers would think, that guy's been convicted of murder. That guy we know was a leading paramilitary in either a loyalist, unionist, Protestant group or a Catholic Nationalist Republican terrorist group. But we have to move on. So in projects like restorative justice, which I believe in firmly, and I've worked with former murderers who are trying to prevent the next generation of young people being radicalised and getting involved in terrorism and violence. I believe that is one thing that maybe the mindset of police officers, and I'm talking specifically as a police officer, has changed, and that was a big hurdle to get over. At the same time, and I'll use an anecdote, I am involved in lots of projects where we bring people together. So whether they be security experts looking at countering violent extremism methods, or whether we look at community groups or looking at how we can prevent children or young people being radicalised or whatever. So around the world, I would either go and spread the word about lessons learned in Northern Ireland, or indeed invite people here. And I remember bringing a former IRA commander, very senior person who I knew had murdered and been convicted of murder, to meet former members of the American law enforcement and agencies like the CIA, the FBI, NCIS, military intelligence, so on. And as one does at the end of a conversation, I shook hands with the guy. And afterwards we were having a chat, and I said, that's probably the hardest handshake I've ever made in my life. That man murdered people who I've considered as almost brothers and sisters in law enforcement. And he looked at me and said, it was probably one of his hardest handshakes ever as well. And of course, that's the thing. We grow up with perceptions. And if we demonize people or dehumanize people, or in the case of the IRA in particular, they said people like me and my kids, my wife, are legitimate targets. It's okay to kill a police officer. It's all right to murder a police officer, and if his wife or his kids happen to be in the car when the bomb goes off, so what? So when I've talked to young IRA recruits, and indeed other members of Al Qaeda or other organisations, there's something about dehumanising people so that you can somehow live with yourself and live with your act of murder. And I think one of the successes, I suppose, in Northern Ireland is we have engaged with people together. So former IRA or former rampant Republicans, they have engaged with police officers have engaged with them. We have broken down a lot of barriers. I've been responsible for some of that myself, even taking people out of Northern Ireland into safe places to meet in America, New York or Atlanta or San Diego, different places where we can actually engage and we actually work out, there's not that much difference between us. You may be passionate about your family and your community. I'm passionate about mine. At the end of the day, am I going to kill you because I think you've got a different opinion from mine? Definitely not. I'm a police officer. My job is to protect life. Why do you think that? So those sort of conversations, I think, were necessary and continue to be necessary. And that is, as I say, I don't like to be negative, but there's definitely, whether we call it an underclass or an underground movement, or in some cases quite an overt movement of people who still want to refight and rerun the old wars. So that's the reality of the situation in Northern Ireland.
Peace building is definitely an ongoing process
Yeah.
in Ireland and Northern Ireland. What leadership inspired you most regarding peace building and post-agreement?
Within policing, I also respect those leaders, and I hope I was one of them, who put my head above the parapet, or put their heads above the parapet and said, this change is going to happen, which is one of the things I want to say is it's the importance of remembrance. It's the importance of respecting those who've gone before. Different context, different culture. They were doing what they did in the 1970s because that was the best they could do at that time. To judge them by today's standards is ridiculous. But for those who lost their lives in the 1970s or 1980s or 1990s before the peace process, The hurt is still there. The empty chair is still at the table. So those people need to be remembered and respected. But at the same time, leadership's about saying, right, we know this is going to hurt. We know this is going to be difficult, but we're going to do it to the best of our ability. So those leaders of policing who designed and delivered the change program, it's okay for academics, researchers, or politicians, or strategic planners to say, here's what you've got to do. It's then getting an organisation to do it, and an organisation made up of individuals. So there's something about understanding what leadership actually means. Yes, we enforce the law. Yes, we prosecute criminals. We're there to detect crime, but we're also there to work with people. So for me, the leaders who had that vision, the leaders who could articulate that vision, the leaders who could lead by example within policing and the security services, those to me are the right people, not the ones that are stuck in the past. But at the same time, as I hope I said, remembering the past, remembering the context is also extremely important.
Now we've talked about past and we talked a little bit about present. Looking ahead, what elements do you think are most vital to peace building?
One of the 175 recommendations to improve policing was a vision of a new police academy, which at one time was going to be £140 million. The idea would be not just an academy where you trained in skills of driving police vehicles or making arrests or using police weaponry or whatever, but a true community policing academy where the victims of crime would come in, witnesses to crime would come in, people who come from different agencies, care support, welfare units would come in and talk to police officers and work with police officers, making community awareness a central part of training. That police academy still hasn't been delivered. And the report came out in September 1999. So you can work that out. That's 25 years ago since that was just one recommendation that hasn't been fulfilled. A Bill of Rights. I'm a Human Rights Commissioner for Northern Ireland. A Bill of Rights was one of the other recommendations of the Good Friday Agreement. Still hasn't happened. So there is something about finance. There's also about legislation. At the minute, the current government, which is only 1 week old, is wrestling again with the legacy of the conflict and how we have legislation that actually builds and supports peacemaking in terms of reconciliation, dealing with the past, information retrieval. That's a big thing. That just doesn't take money. That takes structures. That takes legislation. That takes a vision of what it is we're trying to accomplish. It takes people to be participating in it. So it has to have credibility. Obviously, within some of the working class parts of society, there are concerns about community development and opportunities for young people. So there's something about not leaving people behind. You can't make peace by giving everything to one side and nothing to the other. That's obvious. But there needs to be balancing throughout the process.
Is there anything else, any final note that you would like to add, no matter if speaking from a community perspective or speaking for the RUC regarding peace in Ireland?
Yeah, peace comes at a cost. And I'm very proud of the fact that I served alongside men and women who paid the ultimate price. People who I can think of, so many of them, who were friends of mine and colleagues of mine, who were murdered, many of them at home, at church, picking their kids up from school, because they chose the profession of being a police officer. And whilst there will be those who will still dehumanise, demonise, and try to destroy the reputation of policing, I am pleased to say that worldwide, Northern Ireland policing, not just due to the bad days, but our response to the challenges of change and reform, we are seen worldwide as world leaders. And I say that having worked in over 50 countries, I'm aware of hundreds of Northern Ireland police officers who are still in big demand right throughout the world because we lived a life, and I hope we set an example where we are not perfect by any means. There were many mistakes made and many things we got wrong. Many people should never have been in the police. I'm not talking to people wearing rose-tinted glasses, but I am very proud of the role that policing played in this country.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.